As I reflect on the rich, beautiful, soulful history of the African American church and its pivotal, inspirational, hopeful, faith-filled, way out of no way determination throughout generations, I find that liberation is internal before it manifests itself on the outside. I often wish UUs could become more fluent in African American style theology. The shout-outs, the wails, the ashes, and amens that signal that you're picking up the officiant's message in a true call and hearty response. And while that fills my heart with longing intellectually, I find our Unitarian Universalist principles serve as an undergirding for any spiritual journey that I travel. And as I've gotten more seasoned, let the church say amen. Amen. The season of pop-pop, as I would call this. I find myself thinking critically about my unique faith journey and it being established both in the rich history and rituals of the African American church and all of the courageous leaders and movements that have been its seeds of hope, transformation, and the spiritual promise that through our faith we will get to that heralded promised land in this life rather than in some hope-filled vision of heaven. In reflection, I'd suggest we work spiritually, physically, fiscally, as if this were our best shot at heaven, and I'd ask that the congregation say, amen. Amen.
And I invite you to continue that feeling of amen and response as we consider the African American church. This program year, we've been exploring how we find hope of liberation in the teaching of different world religions. We've been exploring liberatory thinking in the origin of liberation theology, which is South American Catholicism, but also in humanism and Buddhism and Judaism and Islam, and next month we'll be concluding it with indigenous and native religions. We've been drawing from the Reverend Dr. Miguel de la Torre's works and the essays he edited in the Hope of Liberation and World Religions book. We've been drawing from his words and those of his colleagues of different faiths, but there is one critical voice that he didn't include in his book, and I think his exploration of liberation is incomplete. Dare I challenge my dear professor? It's incomplete without looking at the Black church here in the United States and the theology that is most inspirational in its liberation story for me personally. Now, y'all might not know this, but when I get a Sunday free and I'm needing some spiritual filling, I go to the African American church. I go to AME churches. I don't necessarily believe in the theology, but I need my spirit to be filled. And it fills me so much in the calls, in the response, in the music, in the spirit, in the passion, and in the calls of liberation in a spiritual space. Now, the term Black church or African American church is an incredibly huge umbrella term that describes a very diverse range of denominations and churches that have developed within African American communities in the U.S. through Baptists and Methodists and an African Methodist Episcopal Church known as the AME Church. The Black church has a complicated and challenging history, dating back to the early days of slavery when the enslavers forced enslaved people to convert to Christianity, which was then used as a tool to subvert them. Over time, the Black church played an important, critical role in the social, political, and cultural life of Black Americans. Most important to the liberation story, it was the backbone of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, where many of the leaders of that movement came out of the Black church. They knew to their core that liberating theology and teaching of Jesus never meant for them to be second-class citizens. Now, to be clear, some of the theologies of the typical Black church may not be consistent with some of our liberal UU theologies. In particular, the Black church has organized against gay marriage and for anti-trans legislation. The focus on the individual salvation can work against the collective liberation that they are working so hard to build. But if you want to talk about Black liberation, you cannot separate it from the Black church. The key figure in liberating thinking for Black folks, from my perspective, is James Cone. All hail to the Reverend Dr. James Cone, who died in 2018. He was a prominent African American theologian who is widely considered to be the founder of what's called Black liberation theology. Cone's focused on the intersection of race and theology and social justice. His books included a Black Theology of Liberation, God of the Oppressed, and The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Those books challenged traditional Christian theology and argued that it must be rooted in the experiences and struggles of oppressed people, particularly African Americans. Not all Black church leaders supported Cone, especially the conservative ones, but his theologies shaped the civil rights movement and are still shaping us now. James Cone maintained that the sole reason for the existence of Black theology, as he said, is to put into ordered speech the meaning of God's activity in the world so that the community of the oppressed will recognize that its inner thrust for liberation is not only consistent with the gospel, but is the gospel of Jesus Christ. He found this message in both the Old Testament with the story of Exodus that we just heard about, where God makes himself known as the God of the oppressed, and the New Testament, where he saw the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a sign of God's commitment to all oppressed people. That's reframing some Christianity for you. Cone's work also emphasized the importance of community and collective action in the struggle for liberation. In recognizing that Christianity was often used to justify the oppression of Black Americans, he insisted that a new theology was needed and that it needed to focus on the experiences of the oppressed rather than just upholding the dominant white cultural norms. He saw the role and the obligation of the church to organize and join together in the struggle to help all oppressed people. Cone said, "Any message that is not related to the liberation of the poor in a society is not God's message. Any theology that is indifferent to the theme of liberation is not Christian theology. Can I hear an amen? Amen. So that was pretty strong for the church to hear, right? So imagine their reaction when they heard him say this in the 1960s. Jesus is black.
Duh.
Duh! The liberation of Christ is liberation of all those who are oppressed, but it is particularly the liberation of black people who have suffered more than any other people under the slave system. And Cone just kept getting more liberal and more liberatory. In 2011, he wrote a book that rocked my world, even though I had already shed many of my Christian concepts. In The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Cone made the connection between the cross of Jesus Christ and the lynching tree as symbols of violence and suffering in the United States. Now, imagine how conservative America responded to that. That Christ was black, and that the cross and the lynching tree were similar symbols. Cone argued that both of the symbols represent suffering and redemption. But while the cross has been celebrated and uplifted in Christian theology, the lynching tree was largely ignored and forgotten. He said, the cross has been transformed into a harmless, non-offensive ornament that Christians wear around their necks. It has become a form of cheap grace, an easy way to salvation. Until we can see the cross and the lynching tree together, until we can identify Christ with a re-crucified black body hanging from a lynching tree, there can be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America and no deliverance from the brutal legacy of slavery and white supremacy. He made the astute observation that this was because the lynching tree represented the suffering of specifically black Americans, and that this suffering had been ignored or dismissed by folks in the dominant culture. Instead, Jesus in America was portrayed as white and blue-eyed. Well, we know that's not true, right? We know that's not true. And yet, that's what dominant culture does. Cone took it even further, looking at the historical context of lynching and the ways that it was used as a tool of terror and oppression. In reframing the cross metaphor, Cone invited black Americans into a deeper understanding of the role of suffering in the Christian story and how dominant culture narratives have ignored the suffering of black folks. More of the gospel, according to Cone. He said, the cross and the lynching tree are separated by nearly 2,000 years, but they are both powerful symbols of the suffering experienced by oppressed people. Through the cross, Jesus demonstrates God's solidarity with the oppressed, and through the lynching tree, we see the ways in which the oppressed continue to suffer. They continue to suffer at the hands of their oppressors. By bringing these two symbols together, we can begin to confront the painful legacy of racism in America and to work towards a future of genuine justice and equality. Can I get an amen? So how do we as Unitarian Universalists take these messages from the Black Church and use them to find hope in these challenging times? How can you use many of whom don't share the same beliefs of Christ and salvation as the more conservative Black Church? How can we use those messages? Well, first, we must acknowledge that we share a long history of advocating for social justice and equality, and that we both work to instill resilience and develop community as tools for resistance and strength. Our very community creating that we do each week, each day, are tools for resistance and change. We both believe in the core message that our faith is on the side with the oppressed. This message can offer hope to those who are struggling with the injustices and the inequalities of the world. Instead, we focus on the power of energy that is working towards a more just and equitable world. You're getting there. We both focus on the importance of community and collective action. In the face of systemic oppression, the Black church has often relied on the strength of its community to provide support, respite, and organization. That sense of community can be a source of hope as it reminds us that we are not alone in our struggle, and that together we can create powerful change. And finally, both the Black church and Unitarian Universalism believe that change is possible. It is inevitable. We believe in that long arc that bends towards justice. We believe that our faith is instrumental to bending it. We believe that our faith is the best container for perseverance and commitment, and we are compelled to make the world a better place. Amen. Can we? Can we do it? Can we do that? Yes, our theology is different, but there is far more that is similar. So I challenge you today to think about how you can draw inspiration, message, hope, action from the Black church, and find hope and action and movement and inspiration for a more liberatory, a more just, and a more equitable world. Where do you find your hope and inspiration? How can these messages help you to live a more liberatory life, to lift that arm of oppression, to live your values in the world, and to make this a more just and hopeful world? And the church says, Amen. All yours, Benji.